headline was rather humble. Taxonomy, what impact will it have? But actually, it's a lot of stakes behind this taxonomy word. Just today, there have been a publication of the letter of 7 countries that said, well, the taxonomy should be applied only as a transparency tool. However, the taxonomy is progressively becoming a new standard for the EU policies. Is it so? What are the stakes behind it? And we have excellent speakers today. The topic will be introduced by Andrea Beltramello. He is member of the cabinet of European Commission's Executive Vice President Dombrovskis, and he has been with this subject from the inception. We have Fabio Marchetti from Generali Group, where he's head of international affairs. We have James Watson from Eurogas, Secretary General. We have Antoine Bizet from Électricité de France, where he is policy advisor. And we have Kavita Alufbalia from Uniper, Vice President, Head of Global Positioning. And our event will be concluded by Ilaria Conti, Head of Gas Area of Florence School of Regulation. For short introduction, I now pass the floor to my colleague, Professor Christopher Jones.
Thank you, Andres, and thank you to our panelists that have agreed to be here today. So, understatement of the week, taxonomy is very important to energy companies. So let's unpick that statement a little bit. Obviously, it's going to be very important for energy companies in terms of securing investment. In terms of not just the availability of finance, that's the easy bit. It's actually the increased cost of capital for non-taxonomy compliant activities, which at the end of the day is the basic objective of the taxonomy proposal, sustainable finance. But it goes so much more further than that. Reputational. For companies that find the bulk of their activities within the non-taxonomy compliant list, that becomes a challenge for them, particularly in relation to shareholders. We've seen recent events in the news in this respect, and we all know that this is going to increase. But it goes even further than that, because the taxonomy criteria is becoming accepted. Probably become accepted close to a global standard. We'll see as it moves on, and what Andrea has to say about that, I'd be really interested to hear. But it will set the standard for many of the legislative instruments. We're already seeing that. Hydrogen Europe, for example, said that guarantees of origin should be issued to taxonomy compliant hydrogen, which is challenging, but you see that taxonomy becomes the basis. The Commission has just launched the consultation on environmental energy state aid. And obviously the baseline is, okay, let's limit it to taxonomy compliant investment. It's not necessarily entirely logical, but it's certainly the first port of call. Also, the taxonomy, for those of us who've had the joy of looking into the annexes and trying to calculate numbers, is really, really complex. And for many energy companies that are going to have to comply with taxonomy reporting, this is going to be a real challenge in the first couple of years to do this in an efficient way. The other thing that we're going to look at today is the question that the Commission hasn't covered everything in this taxonomy proposal. It's decided to leave natural gas and nuclear with a two-step approach. One is the promise to do a new taxonomy delegated act by the end of this year, and also to consider additional legislation. And we're very much looking forward to hear, to the extent that Andrea can say anything about this, about what the Commission intends to do here. Because this is really, really important that the Commission gets this right in terms of sustainability. Because over the next decade, there are going to be a significant amount of new investment in gas CCGTs for the coal and phase out and OCGTs for balancing, because if you look at the numbers and the speed that coal and nuclear phase out is happening in Europe, renewables are not going to step up to fill that gap, simply as a matter of fact. We would all wish that the world was different and that renewables could, but they won't. It's a simple fact. So these CCGTs and OCGTs will be built. And if the Commission takes a too theoretical threshold, the only result will be more CO2 in the atmosphere, not less. Because if the Commission sets thresholds for taxonomy for natural gas, which simply as a matter of fact cannot be met in any given market, the only consequence is that the investments will in any event be made, but by using the less efficient technology that is reasonable and economically available in the circumstances. And that is not easy to design for the Commission, one has to say. But it's terribly important to get it right, because if you set thresholds that are economically or practically unattainable, as I mentioned, or require hydrogen over the next 5 or 10 years, which we really need to use the available green hydrogen for the purpose of getting rid of grey hydrogen. If you use it for electricity generation, instead of replacing grey hydrogen, you're increasing the amount of CO2 on the planet and emitted by Europe. So obviously that's not the aim. So the getting this right is really, really important. And it needs to be done in a way that ensures that it's fact-based, not theoretical-based. It needs to really determine what is the most efficient way, sustainable way, of driving investment in the gas turbines that are going to take place in a way that is as sustainable as possible and give us a trajectory to 0 to 2050. So, Andries, I'm going to leave it there in terms of the introduction, and I'm very much looking forward to hear what our speakers have to say.
Thank you, Christopher. So let's start from the basics and what the goals and idea behind it. So Andrea, so the floor is yours for introduction of this taxonomy subject. Sounds very dry, and a lot of, at the same time, it's a lot of juice in this taxonomy. Please.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the Florence School of Regulation and Andries Piebalgs in particular, first for organizing this event and for inviting me to take part in it. So in my introductory remarks, I would just like to take stock of where we are with the taxonomy and what the next steps are, in particular, the implications for energy systems, which is the main topic of today's debate. My first point, obviously, starting from the basis, is that it's an obvious thing to say, which is that we need a great deal of investment and of finance to tackle the challenges that we have, not only in Europe, but in the whole planet. First of all, climate change, obviously, but then also environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, pollution, and so on. And this is why Europe was one of the first, if not the first, continent to look at the issue of sustainable finance and at the role that private finance can play in tackling these challenges. So already several years ago, we identified the need to channel more private finance into sustainable investments with our first action plan on sustainable finance back in 2018. And I also think it's fair to say that since then, we have raised our ambitions quite significantly. We have the Green Deal. We have decided to cut emissions by 55% by 2030, to become climate neutral by 2050. This has been enshrined in the climate law that European Parliament and Council have agreed, politically agreed recently. And none of that obviously will be cheap. I think you will be all familiar with the estimations that the Commission has done of how much money we need to meet these targets. I think by now you will all be familiar with the 350 billion of additional investment per year over the next 10 years that we need only in energy systems in order for us to meet those objectives. And so I think it becomes even more imperative that we come up with ways to stimulate more capital flows into green activities. And this is why we designed the first classification system in the world for sustainable economic activities, the so-called taxonomy that we are discussing today. So at the core, the taxonomy is a common language for all those who want to identify sustainable economic activities into which they will channel their funds. Basically, it helps to know what is green and to sort the green from the greenwash. This is what taxonomy is at its basis. But I think it's also important to remind ourselves of what the taxonomy is not. So the taxonomy is not a mandatory list of activities for investors to invest in, but it is a powerful tool, we think, that provides a guide to activities that help us reach the objectives of the Green Deal. We published the first draft taxonomy, so the first list of economic activities that give a substantial positive contribution to climate change mitigation and adaptation in November. And I would like to thank those of you who have engaged with us and helped us to get where we are today with the first Climate Delegated Act, which the Commission has adopted and which is now being shipped to the European Parliament and to the Member States for their scrutiny. So this, just to remind you, is the first of a series of delegated acts, and it's the one that concerns climate change mitigation and adaptation activities. And it also defines the criteria by which an activity can be considered as do no significant harm to the other environmental objectives of the taxonomy system. Now, I have to say, in all honesty, that this has not been an easy task. I think I can frankly say that in many years working in the Commission and on kind of controversial, politically difficult files, I've never seen an issue that has provoked such a wide range of views and approaches, very opposing ones, and contributions, thousands of contributions from businesses, from scientists, from financial sector, from experts, from civil society, from NGOs, not to mention the very diverging views from member states' governments and from members of the European Parliament from across the political spectrum. And as Commission, we had to bridge those differences. This is our job, so I'm not saying that I'm not asking for pity or for compassion, but I'm just saying the reality of what we had to go through in the past months. And I think we arrived to a balanced text, an ambitious proposals that bridges indeed all these diverging views. And we think it will help companies to identify and communicate about their green activities across many sectors of the economy and gives a common understanding on what we're talking about when we refer to green activities. Obviously, the taxonomy is a transparency tool, but it is also the basis for the financial sector to produce products, labels, standards that can be used to channel that investment. Maybe I will just spend a few words to say what the taxonomy does include. So it covers 170 economic activities of about 40% of EU listed companies in 13 sectors, which represent 80% of EU's greenhouse gas emissions. It's quite a broad range of sectors, going from renewable energy, transport, forestry, manufacturing, buildings, and so on and so forth. And this delegated act in particular, so this list identifies 3 types of activities. So we have the green activities, so those that are green in and of it themselves. So these are the best low carbon activities about what is available today. So for example, renewable energy such as wind and solar. These are the activities that we need to make a substantial contribution to our climate goals, recognizing obviously the huge task that we have to meet the objectives of the Green Deal. And these are tough criteria. Yes, they are tough criteria. Sometimes they even go beyond what is in EU legislation. because sometimes we just need to raise the level of ambition. And obviously, as you all know, we are gearing up for a huge legislative package that we will adopt in a few weeks, the so-called Fit for 55 package, where on many different areas, from transport, from energy, from the land use sector, and so on, we will already go beyond, we'll propose to go beyond what is today's baseline. But we also know that a lot of sectors are not there yet, and it's important that we give to these sectors the opportunity and to help them to get there. So the Delegated Act also identifies the so-called enabling activities. So those activities that allow transformation in other sectors. So these are activities that directly enable others to make a substantial contribution to environmental objectives. And here, examples of these enabling activities are renewable energy technologies, for example, installing energy efficient materials in buildings, research into materials that help those investments, and so on and so forth. And finally, the Delegated Act identifies transitional activities, which I also think maybe are those type of activities that have been most misunderstood. So these are activities where low carbon alternatives are simply not available in technological or in commercial terms, where emission levels represent the best performance in the sector and the industry. So for example, this will be best-in-class cement manufacturing. The limits for these transitional activities are very strict. So because the taxonomy regulation itself sets very strict limits about what these transitional activities can do in order to be eligible. So they cannot get in the way of developing low carbon alternatives. They should not lead to unlocking of carbon intensive assets. They should ultimately be consistent with the pathway towards the Paris Agreement objectives of the 1.5 degree Celsius. The Delegated Act that we adopted is not set in stone. It will evolve in line with science and technology. We will continue to work with experts to help us develop the taxonomy. Experts means scientists, means academics, but it also means industry experts, which are part of our platform for sustainable finance. And then, so this is what the taxonomy is, what it contains. What does it not contain, as Christopher Jones also mentioned? So nuclear and gas activities are indeed not covered by the taxonomy. They're not part of it. But we have already set out the, let's say, pathway of how we will deal with these activities. So first of all, on nuclear energy, we have a dedicated ongoing assessment, which was always foreseen. It was always envisaged that will go like that, so there is no surprise there. We have received the JRC report, and now we are expecting 2 further reports from 2 groups of experts, one group of experts of nuclear safety and radiations, and one group of experts of environmental and health risks. They are doing their scientific evaluations, and we are waiting for their reports, which will help the Commission to make a decision about what to do with the nuclear in line with our better regulation principles. On gas, indeed, we have also, as part of this complementary Delegated Act, where nuclear may also be included, we are considering how to include certain gas activities, again, based on the very strict limits that the taxonomy regulation imposes on us. The limits and criteria that have been agreed by the European Parliament and the Council, and on which the Commission has to respect. But we recognize also that gas has a very important role to play for the transition away from more polluting and higher emitting energy sources. So we are indeed considering how we can come with a new instrument outside of the taxonomy framework. So we are working on the criteria, possible criteria for such an instrument, where we can include gas activities going beyond the strict limits imposed by the taxonomy regulation, and the same for nuclear, where we have some potential issues with the do no significant harm principles of the taxonomy. And then, of course, we will continue, and these indeed will come in the next months. We're working on it in priority and in parallel with the rest of the taxonomy framework, because we have also next year to come with the next Delegated Act, which is already set out in the taxonomy regulation, covering the other 4 environmental objectives. So water and marine resources, circular economy, pollution, prevention and control, and biodiversity. Another thing which is really important to note is that the fact that an activity is not in the taxonomy doesn't mean that it is unsustainable, because we simply could not develop criteria now for each and every single activity, economic activity. It's a question of resources and a question of prioritization. But again, we will continue to develop the taxonomy, and we are really, we welcome a feedback loop with industry on the activities that should be included in the taxonomy and which criteria we should develop for them. Because indeed, the taxonomy is a living document. So as we develop the taxonomy, will be revising the delegated acts on a constant basis. Also, I think it's important to note that for sectors that are not currently in the delegated act, companies with relevant activities can highlight to what extent their activities align with the taxonomy already and the plans that they have to reach such alignment. And this will help investors understand how they can invest in generally green activities. There is indeed a huge appetite from investors. I think we've seen it in the last year, how this interest has exploded. And I think it's important then that we continue to develop an ecosystem of products, of labels, and so on, both for the taxonomy compliant activities, but we can also consider how we build separate labels and standards and so on for activities that help with the transition and with the decarbonization, so that help put the economy on a decarbonization path. And we will be continuing to develop these reflections as we prepare our new sustainable finance strategy that we will also be adopting in the next weeks. I'll stop here. I thank you for the attention, and I look forward to the debate, which I'm sure will be very rich and interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. It was a great presentation. I am now passing to Fabio. Fabio is representing financial sector, but he has very good background in energy. Fabio, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andres, and hello to everyone. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that Generali welcomes the taxonomy regulation, which represents a tool that can help insurers and asset managers by providing clarity in identifying sustainable economic activities and also avoid reputational risks. Indeed, the taxonomy regulation can help the insurance sector more generally in the integration of sustainability consideration in our investments by providing common definitions and metrics, as Andrea just said. We all need more clarity in a very confusing space. I would say there's a jungle out there. Myself personally, some time ago, I was looking for some green investment products, and in the basket, I found there were some companies that had a very high level of coal in their portfolio, and so I thought this wasn't very good from a transparency perspective. So, if we do get the taxonomy right, as major investors, as insurers, as asset managers, we have the possibility to be key players to the transition to a more sustainable society. As I said, Generali has 650 billion euros of assets under management. The whole insurance industry has 11.5 trillion euros of assets under management in Europe. We are Europe's largest institutional investors, and we have an enormous investment firepower that can be used to the benefit of the transition. With taxonomy, our investment strategy will be clear and more transparent to consumers. So overall, I'm very favorable to the EU taxonomy as illustrated by Andrea, and I think it does have a key role to play in promoting transition finance. However, there are 4 aspects that need to be addressed to make this a success. Now, first of all, I think policymakers should be more bold in steering us in a certain direction without creating unintended consequences, of course. Currently, there's much more money than projects to invest in. And this is a problem because we risk diverting a lot of money on few projects and creating bubbles. Finance arrives after the projects. And so what we need is regulation that transforms economic activities. Through the transformation of these economic activities, we obviously come with the financing to make sure that these projects have the sufficient funding to be realized. And as long-term investors, insurers are really well placed to invest in long-term solutions, avoiding stranded assets. Usually we invest our policyholders' money for 30, 40 years, and therefore we know where we need to be in 30, 40 years and don't want to make our policyholders lose money. And again, on the policy area point, I think we need enabling regulation that helps us go in a certain direction. And I just quickly want to mention an example. In our prudential regulation, our prudential requirements in the context of Solvency II, as of today, if we want to invest in a green bond compared to a normal corporate bond, even of a company that maybe has a high CO2 emission, the green bond is less attractive. It's less attractive because there's a high capital charge, but also a lower return. And so in this sense, we need to fix some of these aspects. As Generali, we presented a proposal to the services of the Commission, whereby we want to resolve this sort of, I will call it a green bond penalizing factor currently, where we really find it absurd that green bonds in a certain stage are less attractive than any other normal corporate bond. So this is critical in our perspective. We need enabling regulation that fixes what currently is not working. The second point is the international dimension. As Andrea said, it's good that Europe has a first mover advantage, but at the end of the day, we must all fight for a global approach to this. Doing this alone in Europe is not advisable if the others don't follow. So it's important, even in the context of the international platform on sustainable finance, to really bring as many players as on board. I mean, the capital markets are very integrated, and therefore doing things alone in Europe does not make sense if the others don't follow. And what's more important is that we need to make sure we have a single rule book. We're seeing many, the FSB, IFRS, EFRAG, many bodies and organizations are actually working to to try to put together a common international rule book, and we would welcome that there is one body doing this and that we have one common rule book. And certainly the EU has a key role to play in this. Third, we need to avoid a static view of sustainability. I mean, the taxonomy should avoid being too narrow from an investment perspective, and it should evolve to embed a forward-looking aspect and the right set of incentives for the sustainability transition. So in this respect, we called for a transition taxonomy, as referred by Andrea, really to consider the transition aspects based on company pathways, targets, and milestones. And this would provide a fair and dynamic assessment of sustainability, taking into account the process of transformation and accounting for the life cycle of economic activities, rather than purely providing a static assessment of green activities only. So I think focusing on the transition part of the taxonomy is crucial. And we also need to make sure that we address the S and the G taxonomies, so the social aspect and the governance aspect, as quickly as possible, and also bring the SMEs in the picture. I mean, very often, all of these rules and regulations are applied to the larger corporations, and more we need to make sure that 90% of Europe's economy is on board. So SMEs need to come in the picture. So in essence, in order to provide incentives to all companies to improve their environmental performance, the taxonomy should not only recognize activities that already meet the criteria, but also recognize the efforts towards meeting those criteria over time. And the last point, I really think companies need to show commitment and to do their share. Generali, in its strategy, had an objective of 4.5 billion euros of investment in its strategy 2019 to 2021. We actually overperformed. We reached 6 billion. This year, in the occasion of our 190th anniversary, we presented another 3.5 billion fund called the Finice Fund, which will be basically directed to the recovery, and a strong focus is on the green transition. And new commitments are coming forward for our next strategy, 2021 to 2024. So I think, you know, what the private sector does to actually help policymakers, citizens, consumers go in a certain direction is extremely important. As large corporations, we really need to set the example. Thanks for now, and then we can continue some points during the discussion.
Thank you very much, Fabio. Now we move to energy sector. I am really happy that James has agreed to participate to it, and definitely natural gas issues are still open. And I don't know how much your members of Eurogas are worried about it, but James, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Andres. Honestly, it's a pleasure. So thank you for inviting me. Really great to be here with the FSR again. And greetings to all the participants from very sunny Brussels, which perhaps reflects my mood to some extent, having received my first shot of the dose that will give us some freedom back, apparently some point after the summer, I imagine. In any case, we haven't come to talk about that. We come to talk about taxonomy. And indeed, the question of whether it has an impact or not is one that's very easy to answer. This will have a huge impact. There's no two ways about it. I love the idea that this is somehow a sort of voluntary standard that's only designed for transparency reasons. This will have far-reaching effects. It'll have huge effects on the way that the energy sector is financed from private financiers. I don't really believe in this idea that it's a voluntary standard. When you see people like Christine Lagarde saying we will make it the cornerstone of the ECB's lending policy, you know very well that what we're talking about is creating essentially a tool that will lead to standardization. I know also the EIB have said that when they next look at their guidance, they will also update it in line with what the taxonomy says. So the taxonomy is a gold standard, if you like, for lending policy, and therefore its impact is huge. And I agree with Fabio entirely, this is a global thing. I speak to the Americans regularly. We have good relationships with the Americans, of course, for US LNG. But the reality is that they're telling us that the Biden administration is looking very carefully at what we're doing in sustainable financing. And perhaps they will take as a kind of blueprint what is done in the European Union and tweak it a bit for the American context, of course. And that once again proves one thing that Europe is a leader in, and that is an exporting of regulation. We may not export very much else, but regulation we win on. That's why this is so important. That's why the impact is so profound. And that's why getting it right is really crucial. I think that we can say from the gas sector, it's a bit of a curate egg. This is an English expression, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, which means there are good parts and bad parts. When the curate looked at his egg, he found that there were good bits in it. We would say that in Eurogas. I speak to my members and we say, okay, look, there was some good stuff that was done around the next generation of gases, biogases, hydrogen. Infrastructural provisions are good. They recognize that developing infrastructure for hydrogen and biogas is sustainable. Also for CCS. Ironically, not for CCU. There's a sort of paradox in this. So that if you build a pipe to transport CO2, you're sustainable. And if you build one to utilize the CO2 that is being captured rather than being stored, that isn't sustainable. So this is a paradox because normally when I speak to the paper industry, for example, they're one of the best in class at capturing CO2 at the moment and applying it to their paper products as a nice coating finish. Yet any pipes that they wanted to get to bring CO2 to their plants would now not be considered sustainable. So it's sort of bizarre in a way. So as a curate egg, good bits and bad bits. I think on methane emissions, also very good stuff that's come through there. Like clearly in our sector, we recognize the importance of dealing with fugitive methane emissions. And so it's good to see that that will be considered a sustainable activity because it will require investment And it's good to know that financing institutions from the private sector will also be able to be involved in that. So as I said, there are some good elements of it. I think that one issue that we would probably take is that at the very end, after much argument and much discussion, and probably a huge amount of I would imagine hair pulling and head scratching, we got to the point where 5 minutes before midnight, natural gas suddenly disappears in a puff of magical smoke and it's gone. This is a very strange decision from my perspective, and certainly from our members' perspective. We would have preferred to see natural gas continued within the taxonomy and continue to argue about the thresholds. So pulling it out was an interesting decision at that stage, very late stage. I'm sure that our colleague and friend from EDF will also have something to say about nuclear suffering a similar fate. I don't know whether this had the political desire that was expected. I'm not sure whether it'll make it easier to go through the European Parliament and through the member states, because we already saw that the NGOs pulled out anyway because they're obsessed about biomass. So I'm not sure whether or not that was a political move that will really ease the passing of this particular delegated act. In any case, if we go back to natural gas, because that's why you really invited me, I would say we're looking at the thresholds. The do no significant harm threshold at 270 grams is a challenge for CCGTs today making electricity. No two ways about that. If we're honest, we're talking in the range of sort of best in class around 350. So now I hear Andrea saying that when we're looking at the next delegated act for natural gas, that we're going to go beyond the limits of the taxonomy. Well, I think we're going to have to, because that's the actual reality of the ground. We believe in being science-based and fact-based, and this is how we should approach it. And yet we will need CCGTs. We will need them, not just in Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic and Bulgaria, which are always trotted out as the sort of, oh, we have to do something special for the just transition regions. Well, actually, Belgium is going to phase out nuclear and is going to replace it with renewable electricity and gas. Now, do we want to make the Belgians pay unnecessarily more money for an energy transition and a pathway with a green energy minister that supports this, a pathway that they see is the right way to reduce CO2 emissions in the long term? I think the question of OCGTs is also good because, of course, they have a higher CO2 emission, but you would utilize them less over a period of time because they're there for balancing. It's not they run forever and ever, amen. Not at all. They are there to be used when you need them. And of course, they are quite efficient when you need to use them and can ramp up very quickly. So I think that when we're talking about what we need from the Delegated Act on natural gas, we will need to actually be very pragmatic, which I think is one element that has really been missed from the existing taxonomy. It's been kind of idealistic, and that's very nice. It's all kind of grandmother's apple pie and all that sort of thing. Lovely, but that's not how you do business. Business needs to know what it should invest today to deliver the objectives of 2050. I have read numerous articles that say that what we've achieved so far with the taxonomy, again, Fabio said it in a way, he didn't say it quite like this, but there is a huge risk of just creating bubbles. There will be some very small amounts of activities that will be considered to be sustainable. There's a huge amount of money which will try to pour into that massive, massive bubble creation. And I don't think anybody in banking likes bubbles because we've been there many, many times before. So that is a risk that is coming out of this taxonomy. I hope with the Delegated Act on natural gas, we will see more pragmatism because that is what is needed. The energy transition cannot be based on grandmother's apple pie. It must be based on reality, on fact, on what is needed now in many different contexts, in many different geographies. And I'll finish with one very important point because I do think it is important. Fabio also, Fabio, you go before me, so I have to also feed off what you said. It's inevitable. I kind of threw my notes out of the window as I listened to you and Andrea speaking. S, part of ESG, should not be forgotten. This is not just about investing in environmental goods, in my opinion. We should be investing in the things where Europe is also leading in. We should be investing in the technologies that Europe leads in. That means that we should be looking, as we should, at all of the different manufacturing sectors that we also are leading in the energy sector. Gaseous technologies is where we really are leading. If you think of electrolyzers, if you think of CCS, if you think of CCU, these are the technologies, anaerobic digesters. And I say that with very, very good intent because actually the union's voice should be heard because those are jobs that are, as they describe them, quality jobs, non-seasonal, they are there for life. People get skills, they are trained. If we ignore the S part, we are ignoring society, we're ignoring the unions, and we need their voices, and we need to work together with the workers, with the employers to achieve our objective. So when we do this taxonomy, we should have a very strong voice for the unions who we work very closely with in Eurogas, because they are also very positive about the potential developments in the gas sector, where we have a very strong unionized labour force. This is important, should not be forgotten, and we must make sure that as we go forward with the next Delegated Act, that we take into account all of the different elements and not just the idealism that has underpinned a lot of the work that I've seen to date. Thank you for that, Andres. As I say, it's always my pleasure to speak to you. Hope you found what I said useful, and I'm very happy to follow up with further questions and opinions, as you know.
Thank you, James. It was a very open statement and much appreciate your participation. You, in a way, already addressed Antoine. So Antoine is from EDF, and it's not big secret that EDF has quite substantial nuclear in its portfolio. I don't know, Antoine, if you would focus on nuclear, but the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andres. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Andres and Christopher, for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be with you and share EDF views on taxonomy, and more precisely, as you said, on the place of nuclear in the taxonomy. Firstly, I would like to underline that EDF largely supports the Commission initiatives in sustainable finance to achieve 2030 and 2050 climate objectives. Commission's efforts to build an enabling and fair financial regulation must continue, as it has been said already, in the international framework through the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, whose objective should be to harmonize approaches and intensify the mobilization of private capital for environmentally sustainable investment. So to achieve these very ambitious goals, EDF is convinced that sustainable finance mechanism must integrate all low carbon technologies because given the climate emergency, we firmly believe that it would be too risky to only count on renewable energy to achieve these targets. So by proposing a unified classification system, the taxonomy is a tool that allows investors to compare the profile of companies and thus to direct financial flows towards truly sustainable activities. It also avoids greenwashing, as all companies will be subject to its comparable and verifiable reporting. And this comparability is for us a key element of the taxonomy. Just one figure to present EDF Group's contribution in this matter. We are a leading player in sustainable finance, as we emit already something like 7 billion in green bonds. Okay, back to taxonomy. I want to stress that and you already said it, Andres, we remain vigilant on different aspects. First, the scope of activities included in the taxonomy and the way it is going to be implemented. So on the perimeter then, of course, we welcome the inclusion in the taxonomy of renewable energy. There were no suspense on that, but also hydrogen and hydropower, as these three technologies are essential pillars of the EDF Group's low carbon strategy. As you're certainly aware, hydropower has been the subject of lengthy discussions, both on its contribution to climate objective and on the DNSH criteria to be met. The endpoint in the Delegated Act adopted the 21st of April seems acceptable to us, as it is for hydrogen. So these are very good points. Here it comes the case of nuclear power, which is indeed extremely problematic for us. I just want to go back a few months in the past, and let's remember the technical expert group's report delivered in spring 2020, in which it has stated that evidence on the potential substantial contribution of nuclear energy to climate mitigation was extensive and clear. However, it also points out that it was impossible to conclude on the DNSH criterion, and more specifically on the absence of damage to the circular economy, given the conditions for long-term management of radioactive waste. So that's why, to tackle this issue, the GRC was commissioned and delivered its report in March 2021. And it states that, let me quote, the analysis did not reveal any science-based evidence that nuclear energy does more harm to human health, and to the environment than other electricity production technologies already included in the taxonomy as activities supporting climate change mitigation. So it was for us, of course, very good news. The next step are as follows. It has been said by Mr. Beltramel, I think, the delivery of the opinions of 2 expert groups expected at the end of June. They must give their opinion on the GRC report, and on this basis, the Commission's position is expected during the summer. So we therefore believe that, in line with the scientific principle that should guide the taxonomy, nuclear should be included in the taxonomy, and we strongly hope that science-based reasoning will prevail over any political consideration. Yeah, it sounds a little bit like James just said about a pragmatic approach. In these circumstances and subject to the opinions still awaited, we believe that the technical criteria identified by the GRC in its report for nuclear power generation should be taken as they stand, as they are science-based. Let me just underline that there is also a legal issue in that topic. By non-including nuclear energy in the taxonomy, it would breach the equal treatment principle and should prejudice the requirement to limit distortions of competition mentioned in the June 2020 regulation. We will therefore pay close attention to the position of the Commission to be taken on nuclear and gas. Obviously, the issues are not the same for these 2 energy. The carbon footprint for nuclear is not really an issue, as set in a very recent study on EDF Energy Sizewell nuclear power plants project in UK, with a footprint of 6.1 gram per kilowatt-hour. The issue for nuclear is waste management. And on that regard, the GRC conclusions are likely to answer questions, including those concerning the robustness of deep geological storage for the most radioactive wastes. Yeah, French and Finnish projects in particular are progressing well, and such a site should be in operation in the next few years. A few words about implementation of the taxonomy. It also has been said, as it is not yet finalized, but taxonomy principles are already being disseminated in several areas of European regulation, such as national recovery plans, stated guidelines, revision of the regulation on trans-European networks. This principle, and especially DNSH1, are indeed very useful and powerful, and they must be deployed rigorously and correctly. And in that regard, it was surprising for us that the exclusion of nuclear, which we hope is only temporary, has already been taken up and taken for granted in other regulations, such as Ecolabel. To conclude, once again, we consider that taxonomy is a very positive tool, which must serve the climate objectives of the Union and its member states. And to do this, it must be based on all available technologies, including nuclear, as the British, Americans, Chinese, and Canadians seems to want to do in their own taxonomy. Thank you, Andres.
Thank you, Anton. Very clear position. Kavita, now the floor goes to you. I know that you have presentation, so please start sharing the screen. And we are very, very thrilled to know what you are going to say. As I remind, Kavita is coming from Uniper, but you could also see on her slide. Kavita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anders. Thank you, colleagues. It's such a pleasure to be on this distinguished panel, and thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. I'm wondering if I should also just throw my notes aside, but I've got this presentation. I'm going to run you through it because I think it might be quite helpful to understand where we're coming from based on a lot of things we've heard as well. So I just want to revert back to something that Fabio said earlier, and that is that it's important to avoid a static view and to take into account company targets and milestones. And I couldn't agree more, because that is really, really important in our context. And this is all about context, this topic. So basically, just to tell you a little bit about us, about Uniper and our transition agenda, and where we're coming from. So basically, we're an international energy company, as you all know, part of the Fortum Group, with 11,500 employees, operations in more than 40 countries. Now, our portfolio comprises industrial scale plants, trading activities, and service provisions. And we are really in the business of security of supply in pretty much all of our markets. And I'll explain why in a second, given our portfolio. So we've been listed since 2016, post-split from what was then Aon, the Aon Group in the former consistence, and we're Germany's third largest listed utility. So basically, our activities at a glance. To sum it up, basically we have 7.7 BCM of gas storage capacity. Now that makes us Europe's third largest gas storage provider. And we also have approximately 379 terawatt hours in long-term gas contracts. And that is 1/4 of Germany's demand. So I think that in a sense already puts our activities into context and why taxonomy is so incredibly important. And as you can see from the bottom of that slide, it really is about all sorts of activities spanning from nuclear to hydro. Coal is still in the mix as well. And basically it really is about the transition for us. So at the moment, our portfolio consists of 51%, it's pretty much gas-based, and 10% hydro. And the reason why I'm highlighting those two parts of our portfolio is because it just shows that the gas discussion and any kind of further legislation that we will see or hopefully see is critical for us. And the hydro part of our business is what is deemed pretty much as the sustainable part at the moment. And we do not think that accurately reflects the role that we play in the whole transition picture. And now I want to basically just say a few words on our targets that we've set ourselves, going beyond what's actually required to us at national level as well in the markets that we're in. So we've promised to reduce our emissions further by a further 50% overall emissions of the whole portfolio by 2030. And we've also pledged to become carbon neutral for our European power portfolio by 2035. So basically, we're willing to walk the talk, and we've already set everything in motion to make this happen and to achieve this. And these are basically the three pillars that we've based our strategy on, which has actually just been reconfirmed as well. When it comes to coal, this is just purely about de-risking and decarbonizing, and the targets are in place in Germany and in other markets as well. And obviously we're well aware of political discussions, we're open to discussing these further, but it is a question of politics at the end of the day. Then there is this carbonless generation aspect, and this is us basically moving into the renewable space. So we've pledged to expand our portfolio And we're going to be adding 1 gigawatt of RES by 2025 and a further 3 gigawatts in the subsequent years. And we're basically also going to move into the space of doing this by investing in long-term PPAs, power purchase agreements. So this is basically this is the area that we're moving into and where we want to go. And then what's so critical is, of course, the gas part of our business, and how do we leverage our current portfolio, expand and decarbonize it? Because as James rightly put it, those jobs, everything hinges upon that in our markets. So this is where basically H2 comes into the scope, and why, again, taxonomy in the hydrogen aspects is really, really, really important for us. So I'm going to skip this because Andrea basically just gave a fantastic introduction, and everyone knows now at this point in time what taxonomy means. But for us, it really is about the technical screening criteria in so many ways, and determining those, and how one has come up with the definition, the process, and the fact that we really do think that these things need to be fact-based. So on all 4 aspects that are key for our portfolio, it is, of course, with regards to hydropower, hydrogen, nuclear, and natural gas. And on hydropower, I think one can say that after a lot of lobbying, and that's maybe lamentable, the final result is one that is fairly positive, and we're particularly happy that obviously pump hydro storage has been recognized as being completely sustainable. At the same time, the thresholds and the requirements in terms of reporting and the assessments that now need to be run, they seem a little arbitrary. And it was interesting to see how all of this was put together in the final stages. And one would need to question that. For us, it's key when it comes to hydro. We see it as really contributing to the climate aspects and to in the energy sphere. And why not take a technology neutral approach, especially in a climate delegated act? It is about CO2 reduction after all. So why would hydro have further requirements going beyond other renewables? So for us, that was just, very hard to follow at times. On the hydrogen, the thresholds for hydrogen production, very, very pleased that obviously it was lifted to 3 tons of CO2 equivalent per ton of H2. But at the same time, we had asked for a higher threshold. And this is simply for the reason that we're worried that low carbon hydrogen will not be deemed sustainable. And there is a very important role for low carbon hydrogen to play in the transition. And that was acknowledged, or that has been acknowledged in the EU's hydrogen strategy. And it is a question of how did one come up with that figure, and does it correspond to the technology that is available and needed. And then I could go into further aspects. There is around storage provisions. It just seemed slightly arbitrary again, in the sense that it does not really favor blending, whereas transmission and distribution, the paragraphs did. So there was a few question marks, or there are a few question marks there again. And here we would also even ask for potentially further clarification in any complementary delegated act for transitional activities in the run up to 2030 in this decade. On nuclear, I couldn't put it better than Antoine has already put it. I mean, the recent JRC report basically made it clear that they could not prove that nuclear does significantly harm the environment, and that is exactly our stance. Again, all of this should be fact-based and relying on reports and studies where possible. And then on natural gas, James put it so well. Everything just disappeared in the last minute following lobbying, and I think here it's going to be really, really important that anything that is forthcoming, again, just takes into account what the OEMs are saying. Companies like Siemens Energy, what are they able to deliver? What can we feasibly invest in those markets where now additional gas capacity is needed, notably Germany for us, and what by when? So BAT was mentioned earlier, and that is really, really important aspect. And in the previous draft I don't think that that was taken sufficiently into account at all times. So basically, to sum up, our main policy asks are that we very much wish or hope for transitional activities to be acknowledged in the way they really should. To ensure planning and investment certainty, and I couldn't agree more with Fabio on this, technical screening criteria should be based on existing regulatory requirements wherever possible. So also reflecting, RED 2, all the discussions, everything that's ongoing at the moment, albeit in the knowledge that, of course, we're scaling up now, and that we're obviously talking about a 55% reduction and renewal thereof. Technology neutral approach, as I've said, really, really critical. And we would really hope that the Commission would abstain from creating a brown taxonomy on investments. This is really about incentivizing companies to do the right thing and to move in the right way. And we completely sign up to that. That is without question. And yeah, last but not least, those reporting requirements around the non-financial directive, it basically needs to be pushed back by a year now, because given the fact that everything's delayed, and the MSEG meeting today, and various different member states putting forward their opinions as well, what we're reading out of it, all of this, is that delegated acts are delayed to next year, etc. And this makes reporting really, really difficult and cumbersome. So a slight or a delay of at least 1 year would be highly preferential. And that's basically that. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kavita. That was really great from all members of panel, so it's really much appreciated. Andrea, is there any particular points that you feel that you need to respond what was mentioned? I know that there have been so many points and you could talk for hours. We don't have so, but any particular issues that you would say, this I need to answer?
Yes, thank you, Andres. Maybe a couple of issues, and thank you very much to all the panelists for making their points so eloquently and so clearly. I will start maybe with the international implications, which I think Fabio raised, but also others. Indeed, this was missing in my introductory remarks just because of time constraints, but indeed, we are very well aware that we are not acting in isolation. We're not in a vacuum, and although we were, I think it's fair to say, leading this work on sustainable finance, we see, first of all, that this is gaining a lot of momentum ahead of the COP26, and we see it in the G20, that this is also getting momentum. The fact that the United States, with the new administrations, are much more interested, at least at federal level, because even during the Trump administration, in fact, there was a lot of interest on sustainable finance from the from the US financial sector, and also from some states and municipalities. But now there is also this interest in more generally in the federal agencies and the Treasury. And the fact that US is also now on board in the G20 leading this work, I think it's very promising. And we see it in our international platform on sustainable finance, which Fabio mentioned, that we're working on things like a common ground taxonomy, for example. Difficult to predict if we will ever have a real common taxonomy, because we have very different starting points and also very different regulatory approaches. But the mere fact that we're talking about a common ground taxonomy, I think it's a very, very good thing. I would like to share James' optimism that the US will now take our taxonomy. I'm not sure. I think we're a bit far from that point. But if we can have a dialogue on common standards and common languages, I think that's a very good thing. And from the Commission, we will certainly strive to have international alignment as far as possible. As you know, internationalism is in our DNA. Then maybe just some remarks about the implications of all of this. Indeed, there are some important reporting obligations that Kavita mentioned. This is the so-called Article 8 provisions in the taxonomy, which has a strong link with provisions on corporate sustainability reporting. And so the certain companies will need to report the alignment of their activities with the taxonomy. We are actually now working on the detailed rules on how this will have to be done. I'm afraid that changing the reporting date means changing the taxonomy regulation. itself. So I think politically it sounds very complex to do, given where we are and the fact that this obligation kick in relatively soon. Our first objective is to get these rules really up and running on time, so that companies can get the reporting, and we are really trying to find every possible solution to make sure that reporting on CapEx, OpEx, turnover, and so on can be done by the deadline. But we do acknowledge the challenges, and we are now, in fact, talking a lot with companies, those who will have to report on the standard concerns. And we are pouring over actually all the feedback that we got on the detail on the draft rules that we have published. On certain aspects, and like more generally how this was done, I mean, I heard many different references to political. So the taxonomy should not be political, or yet it has to go through Parliament and Council. It's not all in the Commission's hands. It's Parliament and Council who have to agree to it. So it is political. But then I also heard that it has to be scientifically based. Yes, it has to be scientifically based. And I think we are based on the taxonomy on science when it comes to JRC report. But okay, I mean, JRC has also been doing for us a lot of modeling on the different pathways. And there, I think the role of gas, we have to also base it on that, on the scientific modeling that we had. We recently had some reports from the International Energy Agency that have made quite some headlines. So yes, we are basing ourselves on science, but that has to be across all energy sources, not just we cannot just selectively cherry pick, when science suits us and when it doesn't. And the same is for pragmatism. We have to be pragmatic across the board, not just when this suits us in a way, So I think we are actually trying to square this circle between political imperatives. We are a political institution. We are working in a political environment, science and pragmatism. And then specifically on a couple of points. So on nuclear, no, this has not disappeared overnight. We are following the approach that has always been envisaged since the beginning. So I don't think this is a surprise what we're doing now. I think we announced this very early on. On gas, yes, indeed, it's true that we took out the gas from the original Delegated Act. I think the reality is that what we proposed for what we had suggested for gas didn't meet anybody's expectations. So, the lobbying, some of you mentioned lobbying. Yes, but the lobbying came from all different sources of people who had very divergent views, from those who thought that even, the way we had enlarged the scope of gas was unacceptable, to those who thought that the way we had enlarged the scope of gas was simply unacceptable, but from the other side, because it was not sufficient. So, I mean, maybe the reason why this was taken out is simply because rather than making everybody unhappy, we prefer to work on a solution that can be pragmatic as you want, still based on science as you want, and still politically acceptable as we need. So this was the reason why we decided to go for this approach. I think I will stop here because I don't want to.
Yeah, thank you, Andreas. Otherwise, Christopher would not be having a chance to put the question or questions that he would like really to do this after the rich presentations and rich information. Christopher.
Thanks, Andreas. It's kind of difficult to follow that up with questions, actually. And you've answered all the things I've written down here. So I'll try going another way and try and poke people a little bit on the natural gas question. Okay, so as Andreas said, the approach has to be pragmatic, science-based, and politically acceptable. Okay, let's go with that. And surely the objective has to be to catalyze investment in the lowest GHG option for any given investment that's going to have to happen. Okay, so first of all, there would be the question, does it have to happen with gas? Could you do it with renewables first? Okay, so that's okay. Because obviously the aim is not to have as Andreas was absolutely saying, it's not to have a politically attractive list that doesn't actually deliver in practice. It's actually to have a list that drives investment. And I was thinking, this gets me to something that James said, pragmatic, yeah, everybody said that, reality-based, yeah, everybody said that, but he said also based on geographic differences and facts. And this is a bit of a new element. I was thinking about that in natural gas, because there is a thing here in natural gas, and like most technologies for taxonomy are linear, meaning that if you build an electrolyzer, you can meet a certain requirement. If you want to build steel, you can either use renewable electricity or not. But natural gas, the most sustainable investment at any given point in time in the investment cycle will depend on where that is in the EU. Let me explain. If you are building a CCGT for gas supply or an OCGT for balancing, you're going to build it where you have notably nuclear or coal phase out, and when there isn't enough renewable electricity. So that gas production has to happen, otherwise the light's going to go off. So whatever the taxonomy list does, that investment is going to happen. But what you can actually do in reality terms in investment, if you happen to be in Poland or if you happen to be on the Dutch coast, are completely different. If you're on the Dutch coast, you can connect it to CHP, probably, because there's a lot of heat demand there and the infrastructure's there, and probably CCS. But if you're in the middle of Poland, you can't, because there's no CO2 network. And if you build it, it will cost you gazillions of euros and make your investment completely worthless. There may or may not be heat demand. And so the approach that taxonomy has to take, this is my question, sorry for being so long, will, for natural gas, obviously have to depend on where you actually are in the EU, which is unique in terms of taxonomy. Because the original approach the Commission said was to do no significant harm of 270 grams. If I understand what James said, the most efficient CCGT today is around 360. So if you say in Poland it has to be 260 grams, and you can't actually do it with CHP, you can't do it with CCS, as a matter of fact, using hydrogen would be a crazy use of hydrogen. It would actually increase the amount of GHG we actually have in Europe until 2030, till you got rid of all the grey hydrogen. You're then going to have the effect of absolutely doing nothing with the list in Poland. And so people, instead of making a best available technology in hydrogen ready, they'll just use the cheapest. And so it would have a negative effect. Whereas if you actually did that investment in Holland, you could do those things. So, sorry, my long-winded question, probably to Andrea, James, Kavita, is how on earth do you do taxonomy in natural gas, given the different factual situation in different countries, which is unique for natural gas compared to hydrogen or steel, etc.?
Taking on this Christopher question, I think we start with James, but for other panel members, anything that you heard from other colleagues would be very, very interesting also, is that you can make a reaction, because we are limited in time, so it should not necessarily be Christopher's question. But so James, is Christopher right on this geography?
I was hoping you were going to ask Andrea first as the policy maker, but all right, let me think about what Chris said. I think that there's some truth. It's not that all countries are having the same energy transition, obviously. But again, in my intervention, what I was saying is that it's true there's a focus on this, what are called just transition regions. And we talk a lot about Poland and Bulgaria and Romania and other places. But there's also Belgium, there's also Germany. I mean, Germany has a lot of renewable electricity installed, most in Europe. And at the same time, there's a very big coal base and a nuclear base, which is being phased out. As of course, you need to be able to invest in natural gas at this moment to support that, because otherwise what Chris said is true. You do get the lights to go out. So in a way, as my sort of mind goes through everything that Chris said, is what we are really probably then talking about is not necessarily the geographical differences, but it's the end uses. What are you using that natural gas for? Is it for balancing renewable electricity? Is it for phasing out coal? Is it for phasing out oil? Is it oil power generation in certain parts of Europe? Those would then be the questions. And maybe that's how you look at a do no significant harm in the context of what you're actually using the natural gas for, when it's being used for electricity production, or perhaps also when it's being used for CHP. So this is a level of complexity, and honestly, Eurogas, we haven't talked about that yet. And Kavita will smile at me as one of our leading members. So I have to say, it's a very interesting idea. I think we have to be very careful, because I'm not very much in favor of the ideas that were even floated at the time, where you say, okay, this group of countries will have this rule for taxonomy, and that group of countries will have another rule. And I think actually what we should be looking at more is what are we using this energy for? I think that is probably a better starting point, which will allow us to be more practical and more fact-based, because Chris is right. As far as I'm aware, we speak to Siemens, we speak to GE, we speak to others. You're not really at this stage below 350 grams. 270 grams was set as do no significant harm. And so therefore there will need to be flexibility. I really took great courage from what Andreas said, is that it would go beyond this in his opening statement, because it is necessary, because there are countries, not just the ones that we always talk about in Central and Eastern Europe, but others that will also need good financing terms to actually deliver the energy transition. I see 0 point in making those investments in CCGTs and OCGGs more expensive, because they will be made, and you're simply adding costs to the energy transition for no good, because you're not going to get away from using natural gas. It's impossible. If you get rid of coal, you get rid of nuclear, as Germany's planning, you don't have much choice. Therefore, what we're just going to say to the Germans, I'm sorry, but because you've chosen that pathway, because of our taxonomy, we're going to have to lend to you at a much higher rate, even though you need it. Tough. So the energy transition just got a whole lot more expensive. For what? For nothing. So that's why I think we need to be pragmatic. I'm still questioning whether we should make geographical differences. I'd like to believe in the European Union as one region, one set of rules. And I think that it is important that probably we start imagining what are the end uses of natural gas and where can we define sustainability around that. As I say, we haven't got a position specifically on that in Eurogas yet. So give us some time to also evolve our thinking and need to talk to the members and understand what is the best way to go. And that's why I wanted Andreas to go first. Thank you very much, Andreas.
No, we will save him that he could reflect. Kavita, what is your take on Christopher's question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna add to what James said, because I'm gonna have to talk about Germany. So, I mean, I'm thinking about a study that the BDI is currently undertaking together with BCG, and it's going to show even more critically the need for extra gas capacity in this decade, at a earlier stage than previously presumed. We're looking at well over 25 gigawatts. So, I mean, in 2022, with obviously nuclear coming offline, and with the ambitious plans in terms of taking hard coal and lignite as well, and in the various different stages that have been put forward, Germany will become an energy importer. And I'm looking towards to Antoine in thinking that, well, you know, it's a good thing that EDF is prolonging the life cycles of several of their plant, because otherwise, you know, things could get a little bit difficult. I want to give one particular example, just because, you know, OCGs and CCGTs and what needs to be built. So we've got a really good example in our portfolio, which is Irsching, and Irsching is a plant in northern, and it consists already of two plants basically. One is 560 megawatts output, that's Irsching 4, and Irsching 5 is a CCGT of 860 megawatts. It's quite big, this thing. And we're adding to it, we're building another OCGT, and we're setting the stone, we're laying the brick actually in a foundation in a month's time. And we're building that because it's been deemed system critical under the Netzreserveverordnung in Germany, basically. We've been told by TenneT to do this. They need this. So, you know, I can only stress that it's, one needs to see all of the kind of regulations and policies, etc., that are coming forward. It would be good if these were squared up, and if there was kind of, if I suppose, you know, also within the Commission, if there was kind of an understanding for, if you do this, then you're going to basically also, it will have implications further down the line. And this idea that security of supply is one that within the triangle isn't or should be given equal consideration. I think we're now in actually at a very critical point of time, which we weren't even a couple of years ago, in various different markets and regions, Germany being one of them, where we actually need to take that more into account now again. So basically I can only stress that in those regional aspects, those nuances in getting that right are critical at this point in time.
Thank you, Kavita. I will move to Antoine, not necessarily for gas, but there are two questions on nuclear as well. From Philip for a complementary taxonomy for nuclear, and he also mentions naturals, why not talking about avoided emissions? So it is a concept. And then there was at the beginning the question about this GRC report. What do you expect from this GRC report? As I understand, it will be, the committee meeting is today. What do you expect from this?
Well, thank you. The GRC report already put on the table some technical criteria, and it states that regarding emissions, nuclear, as it is by definition under 100 grams, should be classified as a substantial contributor to adaptation to climate change. So the question is not really on the level of emission, but rather, as I tried to explain, on the DNSH criteria. Also on that second point, the GRC was quite clear, stating that even if there are no operational plans for manage the waste, there are evidence that it can be operated safely. So we are now expecting the two expert group opinion, and I assume that they are not supposed to redo what GRC has done, but just analyze the methodology of GRC. So we don't expect new technical criteria coming from these two expert groups, but maybe some question about the methodology GRC took. But once again, for nuclear, I really don't think that the point is on reduction of emission.
Yeah, thank you, Antoine. Fabio, we got a couple of questions that are a bit speculative, but I wanted to put on you. One is how taxonomy influence the flows of finance. So do you expect more flows coming in for our sustainable investments, or quite opposite? A lot of flows go outside where you don't have such a type of taxonomy. And the second question, I think you answered about sustainable, the capital cost for sustainable and non-sustainable investments. So it could be not what we would expect, I understand, but please.
Okay, thanks, Andres. No, I mean, certainly the taxonomy will increase flows in, taxonomy compliant, I would say, SDG proof investments. Companies like ours are very careful of trying to channel as much investment as possible, of course, without undermining policyholder protection and the returns on these investments. But really, we believe that in the long term, if we are moving towards carbon neutrality, we know where we're going to. And therefore, more and more, there's going to be bigger chunks of investment going in this direction, of course. I mean, it would make no sense to further finance, for instance, a coal power plant, because we know that that's going to be a stranded asset at the end of the day. So certainly the taxonomy will be a useful metric, but even to in all our activities on non-financial reporting, there's a whole series of, as Andrea said at the beginning, of taxonomy is linked to many other legislative instruments where we need to, of course, provide information to the markets on what we're doing in terms of sustainable investment. Using the taxonomy language will certainly facilitate things. And certainly if you see just the trend of our investments as generally, but I would say all asset managers, all major institutional investors, you see there's always a growing chunk of investments going towards the sustainable path. And therefore, certainly the taxonomy will help clarify things and will fix. Now it's a jungle, as I was saying, and so it's important to put things straight and to know what we're talking about. If we all have a common language, it's easy also for us to say, how much money we're putting on taxonomy related investments and how much money we're putting elsewhere. So this is something that I think will certainly help the financial community. On your second question, then we find ourselves with, I would say, some contradictions, okay? Because as I was saying, if today, if I look at, when we're doing an investment, of course, in the context of our prudential requirements, we have to look at, the capital charge on certain investments. So for example, on infrastructure investments, you have a lower capital charge, long-term infrastructure investments, and that's very good. Currently, there's still no, I would say there's no common agreement that a green investment is less risky. Yeah, so it's dangerous to say, hey, everyone, if you all invest in any sort of green project, you will have less capital charge. But there are some green financial instruments, and I was making an example like green bonds, okay, that currently have a lower rate of return and have a relatively high capital charge, like a normal corporate bond. If I buy a corporate bond of a coal company, I will have the same capital charge as what if I buy a green bond. And at the same time, on the coal company, there's higher return, okay, because the risk is higher, of course, and therefore you're almost given an incentive to invest in the coal company. So this doesn't make absolute sense, and it needs to be fixed in the context of the review of Solvency II. So we have this opportunity now of the review of the prudential regulation on the insurance sector, and we're not calling for a green supporting factor, broad at this stage, but we're looking at the specific financial instruments that currently are, I would say, penalized, and those need to be fixed in order to put, to create, as we say, a level playing field in these financial instruments. And we're linking our proposal of reducing the capital requirements for green bonds to the amount of time you keep that bond in your portfolio. So it's to avoid in and out trading. It's really to ensure that your investment is for the long term. And as insurers, where we do investments for the long term, Andries, you give us all your money and we will give in a few years' time much more to you. But our vision is really for the long term in terms of life insurers. And so we can really do that arbitrage in a much more effective way, maybe than sometimes shorter term investors. So I think, and this is a plea I provide to Andrea, is really to make sure that in the context of this opportunity of Solvency II, that we actually do look into specific instruments that have shown huge resilience even during the COVID crisis. So green bonds have not fluctuated; they've been very stable. They've performed very well. We have some history, of their constant resilience in moments of shock, and therefore we should look into these instruments and try to fix that up. And my last plea is, we're always saying, hey, but the finance is not arriving, yeah? And what we would like is that, yes, finance arrives when you have projects. So get the carbon pricing right. For instance, if we do have a more ambitious carbon pricing policy, you're going to see industrial sectors change much more rapidly. That transformation will bring in projects that obviously will find financing on the markets, because we know that we're going towards a carbon neutrality by 2050, and let alone the 55% by 2030 is a huge challenge that I think will be tough to meet if we don't really change if we don't really change the legislative framework.
Thank you, Fabio. Andrea, if you could excuse me, I would really like to come to conclusion. I know that you can comment, but then we could not conclude our discussion today. And I believe that this issue will come back and back because it's a new issue, very powerful, it seems, and a lot of details. So then definitely we need to focus or on nuclear or natural gas or some renewable technologies. But Ilaria, it's up to you to make the conclusions and to thank also our participants.
Thank you, Andris. Well, very difficult to conclude in 1 minute. The discussion has been really, really interesting. So I really want to thank you, Andris and Christopher, for organizing this and all the speakers today. It was very, very informative. Well, what can we say? We learned a lot today about taxonomy. We learned that taxonomy is anything but an easy issue to discuss. Andrea, you said we should not feel sorry for you, but certainly you have all our sympathy for having it made with this difficult work of coming to what you also said, a balanced text now for taxonomy. We think, and I think what we clearly understood is that taxonomy is a tool, and as a tool, it has different uses where it can be useful in on many different aspects. Certainly, it's important for transparency because, as Andrea explained clearly to us, it helps first of all clarifying the terminology, clarifying the language, and this is extremely important. In FSR, when discussing taxonomy, when researching on taxonomy, we took the point of view also of consumers. So we know that for consumers, it's important to understand what types of fuels we are talking about and what their features are. So taxonomy is also this. Today, we listen to the industry instead. We discuss the impact on the industry and why, because this is a taxonomy for sustainable finance. So that's where investments are, and that's where there needs to be certainty. So I believe we will definitely keep following as FSR this debate, particularly as it seems particularly relevant for the next steps on the taxonomy for sustainable finance to go hand in hand with other initiatives, other legislative initiatives. And we know that there are at least two very important initiatives that we are all expecting. One on 14th of July, the Fit for 55 package, and by the end of the year, the hydrogen and decarbonization of gas markets package. So certainly, if there needs to be at least some consistency, meaning that these different initiatives should at least talk to each other, and that's what we think and we understand would be also appreciated by the industry, which is constantly looking for certainty, long-term certainty for investments starting from today. I would say I went already beyond my 1 minute, so I will stop here, but I look forward to the next discussions. Just as a final remark, trying to answer the main question of today's debate, what impact will it have? I think we can all agree that it will have a very, very big impact. And even yesterday, I listened to a session of the IAEE conference, International Association for Energy Economists, and two very important speakers, one from IEA, one from Engie, from the industry in general. They already referred to this initiative on taxonomy for sustainable finance and considered it extremely important for their work. So it is a tool, it is optional, but everybody's looking at it.
Thank you, Ilaria. Thank you for all the speakers. It's very much appreciated that you found in your busy schedules possibility to participate in our debate. We will definitely continue this issue, and I would conclude. Thank you very much from me, and thank you very much from Christopher. And have a nice day. And have a nice day for our participants in this webinar that have followed.